The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our live chat. I'm Lakelyn Hogan, gerontologist and caregiver advocate with Home Instead Senior Care. So I want to thank you so much for joining us today for our Alzheimer's live chat. Our chats are brought to you by Home Instead Senior Care. We are a network of locally owned franchise offices that offers home care with an individualized approach to helping keep your older adult loved one safe and independent at home. And if you want to learn more, you can always visit our website at homeinstead.com. But before we jump into today's topic of preparing for the final years, I wanted to go over some housekeeping items with you. First of all, we have muted all of your lines, and that's just to reduce the background noise. We want you to be able to continue to move about while you listen to today's chat. Feel free to check email. If the doorbell rings, the dog barks, don't worry, we can't hear it on our end since we've muted all of your lines. But we do want to hear from you, so feel free to type in your questions at any time. There is a chat box on the right-hand side of your screen, and there's no such thing as a silly question, and I'm sure somebody else out there has the same question or a similar one to yours. So again, feel free to type in those questions anytime. We are taking questions live today. And then finally, we're also going to record today's webinar, so don't worry about taking notes. If we mention any resources, we will follow up with you in an email that includes the resources and a link to this recording. That way you can share it. If you have maybe a friend or relative who might benefit from some of the information shared today, you can forward along the webinar so that they can tune in, or if you wanted to go back and listen to a certain section, again, that recording will be available after today's chat. So that really sums up the housekeeping items. So I'll just give you a little insight into today's topic. We know that a diagnosis of dementia involves a steady decline in our loved ones. As of today, there is no cure for dementia, and people with the diagnosis will eventually decline to a point where they will pass away, usually from a complication due to dementia. So today we're going to talk about how to prepare for those final years of life. It's an emotional time. Sometimes it can be physically, mentally, emotionally demanding, but if we are able to talk about it ahead of time, plan ahead, it can really make those final years a little more enjoyable or relaxed, or give a little more peace of mind. And the final years of planning are about so much more than just putting together the appropriate legal documents. It's also about how to live those final years more fully and have the right conversations at the right times to prepare for that road ahead. And today we're very fortunate to have with us an expert who is very well versed in this topic of preparing for our final years. Our guest today is Dr. Julie Masters. She is professor and chair of the Department of Gerontology at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. She holds the Terry Haney Chair of Gerontology. Dr. Masters oversees the activities of the department on the Omaha, Lincoln, and online campuses. In addition, she teaches death and dying on the Lincoln and Omaha campuses and works with honors and graduate students interested in end-of-life issues. Dr. Masters' research interests include end-of-life planning, healthy aging, and aging inmates. So, Julie, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Lakelyn, thank you. And I so appreciate the opportunity to talk about end of life. And credit to you as well as to Home Instead Senior Care for having the vision, the insight, but also the wisdom and compassion to talk about end of life planning. I think this says so much about what you're trying to do as an organization. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that, Julie. And I know we are so passionate about working with family caregivers on their dementia caregiving journey. And we know that, that end stage of the person's, the individual living with dementia's life can bring about so many unknowns, questions. So the more we can prepare families for that, I think the better it is for everyone involved. So again, thank you so much for joining us. And I know when I was reading your little bio, you teach an entire class on death and dying. So we're just going to spend an hour, but I took your class, and I know that there is a whole semester's worth of great material on this subject. I think it's one that our society doesn't talk about enough, but it deserves more discussion. So again, I'm excited that you're here with us to talk about that today.
Likewise.
So we're going to
go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to jump in and say something, because you were talking about, and I think about the caregivers that you support that are caring for folks who have some sort of dementia. And oftentimes we wait until we're in crisis mode to think about things that are going to make a difference in terms of the care we receive. But if we start talking about things much earlier on in the process, and we do something that we've had a guest speaker talk about, this idea of beginning with the end in mind. And when we do that, when we're healthy, we can make better decisions that really reflect our wants, our wishes, and our values over the course of our treatment, rather than waiting until the very end. So the more we can think about it, the better.
Oh, that's most certainly true. So I know, we're talking about people living with dementia and how it's important for them to plan. And you're right, sometimes people wait till that crisis mode or that crisis situation takes place. And in those types of events, people are under a lot of stress. They might be feeling a lot of guilt because they don't quite know what their loved one would have wanted. They're wishing they would have had those conversations sooner. So I love that concept of starting with the end in mind, or is so powerful. And caregivers themselves can be thinking about their own final years too, as they're watching their loved one go through it. I think it's just a conversation for everyone that's a benefit to everyone involved in the caregiving situation.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, we have some questions we're going to go through. And if you're just joining us, we want you to ask questions as well throughout this live chat. It is live. We're taking questions as we speak. So feel free to type in your questions in the question box. But we have a couple to start out with. And I think that this kind of actually speaks really well to what we've already been talking about. Carla wrote in and she said, we started planning at 40 and find that was barely soon enough. We were married for 32 years and we've been planning from earlier on, but is it ever too early to start planning, or when do you recommend that someone starts planning, whether or not they have a diagnosis of dementia?
Well, I would say to that, the sooner the better. And regardless of a diagnosis that I might or might not have at the present time, the sooner that I can begin reflecting, and it's really about thinking about what is it that is important to me in terms of my own life, what is it that brings me joy, what is it that brings me satisfaction in life. As soon as I can begin thinking about those things, then I can begin to reflect on what I would want in the event that I would have some sort of an illness, whether that's a cognitive issue or a physical illness. By thinking ahead what I would want, the decision-making process seems to go a little smoother, because I've given the time and energy to thinking about it earlier on.
Thank you for sharing that, Julie. And I think, and this ties in kind of to our next question. So you think about, you reflect, you think through your wishes, but I think what's so important is the communication of that to those that you love, because it's one thing to kind of figure it out on your own, but if you don't share it with anyone, how are people to know what your how to help you carry out your final years in the way you want to carry them out? So Sissy had wrote in and she said, what do you do when no one wants to talk about it, especially your spouse? So can you speak a little bit to how best to communicate this to those that you love, especially when they're resistant to the topic?
Well, as I think about the question that you just raised, I think about sometimes we go from 0 to 90 in a very short time period, and it can be a rough ride for people, going from just not feeling well to now I have to make some pretty significant and serious decisions on behalf of someone that I really don't know what they would want. And so taking baby steps can help. I think a recent example of someone who maybe might serve as a role model for other people to think about in terms of end-of-life planning was Barbara Bush. And Barbara Bush took a very public approach in terms of her decision about whether or not to receive curative care in the hospital or to move more to palliative care or comfort care. And because she made that decision and did it in a very public way, in some ways, I think she's serving it, has her life served as a role model for other people in terms of what they would want done or not want done. There's Lakelyn, there's a wonderful book by Ira Byock called The Best Care Possible. And he talks about his approach, and he's a palliative and hospice care physician. And he talks about his approach with patients, and he will say to them, what does the best care possible mean to you? What is it that you would want in terms of your own care? Does it mean being present with family and friends? Does it mean spending time at home? Does it mean enjoying the things in life that you have come to appreciate? When you can answer those questions, what you're doing then is, in many respects, setting the stage in terms of what kind of care medical care that you would like to receive, and that your approach to that care is going to be defined by what matters to you most in your life. So I think having those conversations, and in baby steps, and again, not just laying it all out on the table, but gently starting that conversation to say, this is what I would want done if I were to become ill. Or, mom had problems when she was in the last days or weeks or months of her life. I don't think that's what I want. This is what I would want. It starts to lay the foundation or the groundwork for family members, so that if they have to make decisions for you when you can't, they're going to have a feeling that a little more feeling of confidence that they're doing the right thing by you.
Yeah, I think that you made so many great points there, Julie. And I liked your example of Mrs. Bush and how she kind of made her wishes known. And a lot of times when I'm talking to families, I encourage them to start the conversation by sharing a story of maybe a family member or friend who did plan well or didn't plan well, and use that as kind of a conversation starter. So I think that having those role models of people or looking to others to see, how they did it can really help open up that conversation for further discussion. So thank you for that. Go ahead.
Well, and I like the way you've described that by saying, give me an example, give me an idea of kind of what you're thinking in terms of your own experiences with end-of-life care. And because they've already thought about that particular situation or scenario, that will serve to inform future scenarios. So the more that you can engage in conversation, the better. Something else that just to think about is, sometimes for people of faith, they might be hesitant to talk about advanced planning or end-of-life planning because they might have some preconceived notion or ideas about what their faith tradition might support or not support. And so that would be a good time that if you have a trusted minister or rabbi or priest or someone that you can turn to, getting their input can also be helpful, because it gives folks the opportunity to not only include what they want personally, but also what their faith tradition might also allow or not allow.
Yeah, that's so important, those faith traditions, and making considerations for those. And we actually have another question that kind of ties in to that. Helen wrote in, and she said, the Lord decides when someone dies. When did it change to hospice and palliative care? Can you explain the differences or what hospice does. I think as a general society, there's some misconceptions about hospice and palliative care. So Julie, can you tell us a little bit about each of those types of services or those types of care and how they differ, but also some of the benefits? Because I know I've seen people utilize, hospice and palliative care and some that haven't. And there is some differences or some added value that hospice and palliative care can bring. So can you just speak to that a little bit?
Absolutely. Well, I want to talk about hospice and palliative care can be treated separately, or they can be looked at together. And I think they work well together, but you don't necessarily have to be at end of life to receive palliative care. Palliative care is about providing comfort. So if someone has had a chronic condition for the past several years, they could be receiving palliative care, but not be at end of life. In a similar fashion, hospice is about providing comfort. It's about relieving a person's symptoms. It can be physical, psychological, emotional, spiritual. It can be a lot of different things. But included with hospice is the use of palliative care, and that's about providing comfort, relieving the symptoms that the person might have. I guess the difference is really about prognosis. And so in order for someone to qualify for hospice, the way it is set up today is that they would need to have a prognosis, meaning a determination of how long they would be expected to live for 6 months or less. Palliative care is not based on prognosis as much as it's based on diagnosis. So there's kind of some nuances there that I think are worth mentioning. I think Helen, though, in her question to you, raises a good point, because we oftentimes think that the purpose behind hospice is to accelerate the dying process and to move people on. And that couldn't be farther from the truth. What's interesting, Lakelyn, is that some of the larger research studies that have been done with respect to the benefits of hospice have demonstrated that people actually live longer in hospice than when they're receiving aggressive care. And the benefit to that is because the focus now is on relieving symptoms, and it's providing comfort. It's about caring for the person in the last months of their life. The problem that we run into with the utilization of hospice is that people oftentimes have misconceptions about what hospice is, and so they delay using that service. And as a consequence, they may only get to realize the benefits of hospice for a couple of weeks, or in some cases, a couple of days. So my hope is, and that's the beauty of the webinar you're hosting, my hope is that people understand that hospice is about providing comfort, and it's about providing care both to the patient as well as to the family, so that the focus isn't so much on dying as it is on living. And that really is about, when we talk about end-of-life care, we're talking about what can we do to enhance a person's life so that they truly have the opportunity to live. Regardless of the time, they have the opportunity to live.
I like that point of view. And I also was just so interested to hear you say that the research is showing that people who utilize hospice live longer. It really does, kind of debunk the myth that a lot of times people believe about hospice. But I think you said it so beautifully, that hospice is about, making those final months or days the focus not so much on the pain, but also just being a support to the individual and to the family. And I've heard that from a lot of family members that the hospice support team was there as much for them as they were for their loved one that was passing. So it really can be a benefit. So I appreciate you kind of explaining hospice and palliative care, and speaking to some of the benefits of hospice care. And we do have another question that I'm going to ask here in just a moment. But if you, again, have just joined us, please don't hesitate to write in your questions. Julie is happy to answer any questions that you might have. So as we're talking, if any questions pop into your mind, please feel free to chat them at us, and we'll get them answered. But when we talk about, you know, preparing for the final years, it can have a significant impact on the family, especially maybe the primary caregiver. Pam wrote in and said, I took care of my mom. She developed dementia. The doctor said that the nursing home was the option, but I've always felt that I failed the woman who was there for me when no one else was. So any recommendations on, any recommendations on avoiding ending up in a care situation that you believe your loved one would not want, or how to kind of deal with the guilt that might come along with some of the decisions that these families are having to make in their loved ones' final years?
I think in the question that Pam raises is a question that we hear frequently from people who have had to make a decision about moving a loved one, a family member, into a nursing home setting. And there's really two reasons why people are placed in a nursing home setting. One is because of safety. It's no longer safe for them to remain in the home environment. And the other is for their health and well-being, in the sense that the amount of care that they require exceeds what's available in the home, beyond not just having family member, but other supportive services. So having someone move into a nursing home for care is not a decision that's made lightly by caregivers. I mean, what we know is that caregivers struggle in having to make that decision. But what's curious, and I think about a book that was written by a wonderful person, Leela Knox Shanks. And the name of the book is Your Name is Hughes Hannibal Shanks. And in that book, she talks about the changing responsibilities of adult children in caring for a parent or for their parents. And sometimes, because we've always been in this role where they are the decision makers, we look to them for guidance. But sometimes we reach a point where it's no longer possible for them to make that decision. And so then we have to take responsibility. We have to take, if you will, take charge of making the best decision possible in light of the circumstances, so that their health and well-being is maintained. What we can do to try to make this a little more manageable, if that's possible, is to start having conversations earlier in the process. I know sometimes over the course of a lifetime, adult children will say to their parents, Mom, I'll never put you in a nursing home, or Dad, I'll never put you in a nursing home. But sometimes we can't guarantee that. What we can do is have conversations of, if you needed help, what would that look like? And again, it goes back to Dr. Bayak's book, in your mind, what would be the best care possible? And laying out what that scenario could potentially look like, so that everyone understands, here are the options that are available to us. And in a reasonable sense, the best that we can do is option A, and option A might be the nursing home, but it's about giving you the best care possible.
Thank you for sharing all those books, Julie, and for your thoughts on that. I think that you're right. As the sooner we can have these conversations, the better. And I hear too from families who make a promise to never put their loved one in a nursing home, or we promise to keep them at home. And sometimes we make those promises not knowing what the future has in store. And as you mentioned, sometimes it's no longer safe to keep them at home, or the caregiver themselves falls ill or is no longer
Right.
equipped with the skill set to care for their loved one at home. And so when families are talking about it, it's almost like, plan A would be best case scenario. This is what I want to happen. This is where I want to be. But what if we had to go to plan B? How can we make that a situation that you're comfortable with? What would be your thoughts around that? And those types of conversations, again, can help families make decisions that they feel their loved one probably is more, they're more confident in those decision-making settings when they've had those types of conversations. So
And
thanks
I like,
for all of your, yep.
excuse me for interrupting. I really like what you just said about being confident and comfortable in those decisions. And I think sometimes too, what families can see is that they still have a role and a responsibility in terms of the care of their loved one if they move to a nursing home environment. Their role now, though, is being more of a family member as opposed to being that direct caregiver, that they can be present to be at the person's bedside, to hold their hand, to participate in activities with them, to reminisce with them. They still will be involved with their loved one, just in a different way. And so it's again about thinking about the safety and security of the person that's being cared for, but that they still have an opportunity to participate. And I think that's an important thing to think about, that their role doesn't end, it's just transformed.
Yeah, I like how you ended that with their role is just transformed. I think that you're so right in saying that they can still be very much involved in the care, and sometimes they do feel that guilt that they've handed the care over to somebody else, but they can still certainly be involved and be present, and be engaged with their loved one, just in a little bit of a different way. Julie, we've been talking about reflecting on your own wishes, communicating those wishes to those around you, your kind of care and support system, whether it's family, friends, your loved ones. Are there any other steps that families should be considering when preparing for the final years? Any specific documents or anything beyond just those kind of initial processing, what you would want your best care possible to be, who you would want to be in your care circle? Anything beyond that families should be considering?
Well, I think there's a number of documents that take on a legal connotation that are important. So, for instance, having a will that would highlight how assets would be distributed after death gets to be an important piece of information. Sometimes folks just think, well, I'll let you take care of it, or somebody else will need to handle this, but that can be very complicated for survivors. So having a will, talking to possibly working with an area agency on aging with their legal services contact, or through something called the Elder Access Line, a number of legal aid offices around the country, and I would surmise probably in different parts of the world have something similar, where they have attorneys on staff that will work with people 60 years of age and older in helping them prepare a document like a will, but also advanced directives such as a living will, which is typically a 1 or 2 page document that says this is what I want done or not want done, to a durable power of attorney for healthcare. And that particular document, Lakelyn has, what the research is telling us, has more benefit than a living will, because you've designated typically 2 people who will be able to speak on your behalf. Because the thing about the living will and what the research tells us is, while you've indicated what you want, it's hard to anticipate all the different scenarios that might emerge. And so by designating someone to be your healthcare power of attorney, which is different than a power of attorney, but your healthcare power of attorney, that person can speak on your behalf when you're no longer competent. And I have my students do this as part of a death plan project that they all have to complete for class. And when we talk about who would be someone that you would select to make decisions for you, this probably should be someone who is pretty good, first of all, at making decisions. And secondly, if they have a hard time picking out what kind of coffee they're going to buy, that may not be the best person to make end-of-life decisions for you, but someone who is willing to entertain possibilities and has your best interest in mind. So the living will, the durable power of attorney for healthcare, and then there's this wonderful document called the 5 Wishes. And the 5 Wishes is a document that is available to people in select states where it's legal, but anybody can really fill out the form. But it looks at what kind of care do I want? How do I want to be treated? What do I want my family to know? Who would make decisions for me? So it's this lovely collection of the things that we talked about with the living will and the durable power of attorney for healthcare, and then a little more to that. How often would we think if we were in the hospital, would we want someone there to hold our hand? Or would we want someone to put a cool cloth on our forehead? And as minimal in terms of care as that might seem, those things can make a real difference. Do I want music playing if I'm in a nursing home? Do I want somebody saying prayers at my bedside? So the 5 Wishes gives folks an opportunity, really a starting point, to think about what they want in terms of their own care. Now I want to back up for just a second. I mentioned the healthcare power of attorney. There is also something called a power of attorney, which is different. A power of attorney is someone who can make financial decisions for an individual, but not healthcare decisions. And so I think for the people participating in the webinar, as well as others who might listen to this down the road, it's really working with someone with a legal background that can help you distinguish number one, the types of documents that are out there, but secondly, what are the best documents to complete in terms of your own future care.
Thank you for all of that information, Julie. And you had mentioned that you make your students fill out those documents, and I in your class had to fill out my own documents, and it really does make you reflect on what you would want, in your final years. And I, even at my young age at that time, I was able to share that with my family, and we had discussions. My mom didn't know that I wanted some of these decisions made. She would have made totally different decisions for me. So I think it's never too early to start considering your final years, even when you're in your 20s and 30s, you can even be thinking about this. So it's a topic for all generations,
Yes.
not just for people who are in their post-retirement years and whatnot. So thank you for sharing that.
You are welcome.
And we just had a question come in from Anita. Anita's listening in with us on the call, and she's wondering, we've been talking a lot about, I've been mentioning dementia a lot. So she is asking, is there a difference between dementia and Alzheimer's? Julie, would you mind explaining how Alzheimer's is a type of dementia and kind of what that means?
So I think you've just done a great job in really answering it. If you think about it, dementia is an umbrella term to describe a number of disorders, if you will, that impact cognition or impact thinking. Alzheimer's disease is one of a myriad of dementias that people can be diagnosed with because of cognitive impairment.
Thank you, Julie. So Anita, we hope that was helpful in clarifying that. We also see sometimes dementia related to Parkinson's, which is more of a Lewy body type of dementia. We actually had a question come in regards to Parkinson's. That was my attempt at a smooth segue to our next question. But Tabitha writes in, she says, my boyfriend has the beginning stage of Parkinson's. He hasn't gotten rough yet, or it sounds like too far into the disease, but I'm sure that there are rough times to come. The bad part is he doesn't want to talk about it. Both his mother and father had Parkinson's. His father took his own life, and unfortunately, his mother died of older age. She says, I work in the home healthcare field, so I'm pretty aware of what's going to happen, although it's never happened to me, so that will make things a little different. So do we have any suggestions for Tabitha as she tries to talk with her boyfriend about his disease and how that might affect his final years?
Well, I think one thing that's important for Tabitha to know is how fortunate he is to have her in his life. Oftentimes when we think about people who are faced with chronic illnesses that will only get worse as time goes on, knowing that you have a support system in place is key. A support system not only in terms of family and friends, but also professional caregivers. So all those things are significant. So, I just want to make sure that Tabitha understands how important her role is. I think there's a couple of things that come to mind. First of all, for him and his life experience in having both his parents having Parkinson's disease is framing how he's looking at his own Parkinson's, meaning their experiences, and particularly for his father, who reached a point where he made a decision to take his life because it was so much, might be very frightening for him, might be obviously very concerning for him. So I think for him to be able to, and for her to be able to talk about what his prognosis is, what his diagnosis is, because there's different kinds of Parkinson's disease. The sort of Parkinson's that he may have might be different than what his parents had. And so getting a clear understanding of diagnosis is very important. But I think the other thing, again, is talking about his prognosis. He is basing his future on his experiences in the past. And those experiences in the past may not be necessarily an accurate portrayal of what his future will look like. So the more information that the two of them can gather and collect and understand will be key. I think the other thing, though, too, and Parkinson's is such a tough disease, it's finding a good network or support system in terms of, for instance, Parkinson's groups, support groups that might be available, working with different organizations that can help them access and identify resources, not only now, but for the future, will be vital for his managing the disease that he's living with at the present time.
Julie, thanks so much for sharing that. And I think one thing that you mentioned that can be so impactful for family caregivers or the family care partners is that finding that support group. I know that, people that are involved in our live chats and our Remember for Alzheimer's Facebook page, many of them are caring for a loved one in some capacity and find support, find resources through these different avenues. So I know here in our local community, we have some wonderful Parkinson's support groups and Alzheimer's related or dementia related support groups. So having caregivers find that emotional support from other caregivers who are going through some of the same caregiving issues can be extremely helpful for many people.
Well, and I think, and you've said that so well, Lakelyn, and it's about finding support. And you may not need that support today, but there's a good chance you're going to need it in the future. The other thought that comes to mind is that as people progress through their caregiving role and their sense of responsibility, they may also have ideas to share with other people. And I think that's the beauty of caregiver support groups or caregiver programming, is that the caregivers have this opportunity to learn from one another. And the more we can share, the more the burden that we feel in terms of caring for a loved one is lightened, because we're learning from other people. And we're also sharing our own ideas as well.
Most certainly. On the email group that goes along with our Facebook page and our website, we have a large following, and a lot of times we have people write into us with questions, and we put that back out to our caregiving community, and I'm blown away every single time by the response we get, because people are so eager to share their experience, positive or negative, on the same or similar situation. It's just so neat to see that community rally around one another and really support one another. So I like how you said, if you don't need it today, you'll probably need it down the road. So it's always good to get connected early on in that caregiving journey. And then, and this is a topic that I think I brought up probably in the last 3 chats, but it's something that I think comes along with preparing for the final years, especially when someone is caring for a person living with dementia. And that's, as we know, dementia usually, with the decline, causes the individual to lose memories and sometimes even forget the person's name that is caring for them. And so caregivers often go through this ambiguous loss. And so, Julie, do you have any insight into that term ambiguous loss that you could share, and how it relates to kind of the final years, or the emotional aspect of preparing for the final years, especially for someone living with dementia?
Well, I think it's a challenge for a caregiver who's giving 100% of themselves to caring for a loved one who may no longer recognize them. And so what happens is that for that caregiver, they have to change in terms of their own sense of who they are in the relationship. And I want to go back to, if I could for just a second, Leela Shank's book. And there's a part in the book where she talks about, and her husband had Alzheimer's disease, and she talks about they were in their home together, that they had raised their children, and he looked over at her and he said, "Do your parents know you're here?" And it obviously took her quite by surprise, because her parents had been gone for many years, had died, and she thought, how does he think, that my parents would wonder if I'm here? But what she learned from that, and Leela was a brilliant mind, what she learned from that was that he no longer saw her as his wife, that he no longer was connected to her in the present time. And for her, Lakelyn, she had to change her identity in that relationship. She moved from being his wife to his caregiver. And while she was sad that this person that she loved so dearly was no longer her husband in the sense that he had been all those years, she took on a new role, and that new role of being his caregiver. And while she grieved and she felt bad, she also knew that she had a task at hand that she had to attend to. And I think what that did is it helped her to find a different voice in herself in terms of what she could do for her husband, but also what she was able to do in her life for countless caregivers, to see that their role, while evolving and while changing, could still be meaningful. There's a great line from a book by Nancy Cobb, C-O-B-B, and the title of the book is In Lieu, L-I-E-U, In Lieu of Flowers. And Lakelyn, she cared for both her mom and dad, who they both had Alzheimer's disease. He was first, and then his wife second. And she said 2 things that I think have a little value here, if I may. The first, she said, is that death forces a grace period on all of us. The dying can offer the living a final chance to be the best they can be. And there's some power to that, isn't there? That idea that when I'm in the midst of having significant memory issues, and I may not know you, but your ability to continue to know me and care for me is powerful. It's affirming in terms of what one human being can do for another. And then the other that she says is that death is the great equalizer. Death dares us to define what really matters. Death dares us to define what really matters. And I think about caregivers that I've encountered over the years, and especially those caring for someone with dementia or Alzheimer's disease specifically. And they are people that are transformed. They are people who are committed to doing the very best that they can for their loved one. And when we as professionals can do our part to help them gain access to the services that they need and to recognize when those services have value, that they can continue in their role. So often we see caregiving as a burden, but there's some new research that's emerging that says that it can be affirming or reaffirming in terms of what a caregiver is able to offer to another person. So in the midst of loss, I think there's also gain. And that gain is becoming a new person in terms of the care that I can provide to someone else.
Both of those quotes just, they're beautiful. One, thank you for sharing those with us, Julie, but I think they have such a powerful message that, caregiving, when you're in the thick of it, some days you probably wonder, how will I go on? This is, straining and stressful, but if we can try to stop and reflect on the positives or the benefits that it brings, it allows us to spend time with the person we're caring for and help them in a unique way. So thank you for sharing those quotes with us, Julie. We have time for a few more questions. So if you're listening and you have one last question you'd like to type in, please don't hesitate to. We have a little time left. But Julie, I thought we could spend some of the last remaining minutes that we have talking a little bit about the final years involves the individual passing away, which brings grief. And it also, especially for somebody who's been almost a 24-hour caregiver or dedicated much of their time to caregiving, that person's no longer there. Their role as a caregiver in some ways goes away, or maybe they have then the opportunity to serve others that are going through similar situations. But can you speak to some of, or have any advice for caregivers who maybe are experiencing that grief or experiencing now a loss of that caregiving role due to the passing of their loved one?
I think it's interesting that when we use the word grief, we sometimes have an expectation of how long someone should grieve in terms of their experiences in losing someone that they love. And I think, and just as you set this up in terms of someone that's providing 24-hour care, they're grieving, and just their fatigue from that process may require more time than someone else that may not be 100% fully into providing care. And I think that's important. Each person that is grieving is going to come at their grief in a very different way. So there's no set amount of time someone should grieve. What there is, though, is this sense that people, it takes time for people to start feeling like themselves again and getting back to that, the things that may have brought them happiness and joy in their life. It may take time for them to recover and get back to seeing joy and happiness in their life. I think the other thing to realize, and if you think about the word grief, it's 5 letters. And most folks will have 5 fingers on their hand. And if you think about it with grief, what we can do is we can hold grief in our hand in a tight fist and not want to share that with others. But the longer that we hold our hand in a fist and keep it tighter and tighter and try to hold it in, and I wouldn't ask anybody to do this now, but Lakelyn, if you try it, you know that after a while your hand gets really tired and fatigued and it cramps up. But when we open up our hand to receive care from other people, as a caregiver, we're not used to doing that because it's always been about us doing for others. But when we can open up our hearts to let other people provide us care, or to listen to our stories, or to be there in our grieving journey, that can help lighten the burden that we feel in terms of that loss. So it's about opening our hands and our hearts to other people in terms of care. You know, I think earlier on when we were talking about hospice, the beauty about hospice is it's care for both the patient as well as the family. And for family, hospice will provide bereavement support. And that's generally 13 months, for a period of 13 months after a person has died. And it could be a phone call. It could be, why don't you come to a group, a support group, something of that sort. But it's knowing that your loved one has received the best care possible. And now you still will be cared for after a period of time that that person is no longer in this life, that there are other people that can provide care for you. So I think it's about being open to other people. It's about realizing that we don't get over our grief or our loss overnight, that it takes time. But there is a time where we start to feeling better.
Thank you, Julie. Those are all, again, great pieces of advice. And I liked your example of the fist. It's a nice visual of grief. And as you said, if you're able to open up your palm and let people help to comfort you or care for you along that grieving journey, you'll be less likely to hold it in tight. And I think one of the phrases that I've heard about grief is that, it never truly goes away, but it just gets lighter with time. And I liked that it kind of gives you a nice conception of grief. And if you haven't been through a significant loss in that grieving period, it's a nice way. That fist example and that phrase, lighter over time, kind of helps people better understand the grieving process. But it is something that we all will experience throughout our lifetime. For some people, especially for the older people that we care for, they've likely experienced a lot of grief as their older friends, family members pass away. And so again, I think it's something our society doesn't talk about enough. And I know in your class, Death, Dying, and Grieving, as a society, we sometimes don't give people the time they need to grieve. In a busy working world, you get sometimes a couple days to a week off and are expected to be right back at the grind. But people need to take the time to grieve and to allow themselves that. And one of the other things that we talked about is the Jewish faith. They sit Shiva. I think you and I have talked about this before, and really allow themselves the time to grieve. So it's interesting how society plays into it, how religion and culture all play into that process. So again, that's why it's good to have these conversations and to start talking about those final years, because again, it's just not talked about enough in our society, I would say.
It's interesting too, and I'm going to go back to Nancy Cobb's book, that she talks about, sometimes when people die, we live with regret because there's so many things we could have, should have, would have done if we'd only known. But the one thing that we do know, and it's guaranteed, we will all die. That's just, that is what it is. And so acknowledging that that's going to happen, and then taking the moment in front of you, taking the moment in front of you today, tomorrow, whatever, to be able to tell people how you feel about them can help to relieve some of the regrets that we might have because we didn't tell people what was in our heart and in our heart and in our minds. Letting them know how we feel about them, letting them know how much they care about us, and how much we care for them comes into play. You know, another thing that I have the students do, and when you talk about the Jewish faith, there's something that's called the ethical will that comes out of the Judaic tradition, and it's this beautiful document where people write about the things that have mattered the most in their lives. And I think when we can communicate that to other people, and when people do die, we don't feel like there's unfinished business because we've addressed what's needed to be addressed at the time that it's given to us.
I think that that's a great document or a great way to express those thoughts to those around you that you love. And I'm going to switch to the next slide here to just show the resources, and I'll speak to that in just a moment. But I think sometimes when we're working with family caregivers, caring for someone with dementia, and you talk about the telling those that you love them, and some say, well, my mom doesn't know who I am, let alone will she know that I've said that I've loved her, especially towards the end. But I think that it doesn't also always have to be in the words that we say, but it also can be in that handheld holding at the end of life, or in a nonverbal way as well. So I think when we're thinking about expressing those affections or those kind of final words of I love you, or please forgive me, even if you can't verbally say them, you can kind of show it in a non-physical or non-verbal way as well.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so we are ending kind of the hour here, and I did want to share some dementia resources with everyone. Home Instead recently put together kind of a whole public education campaign on planning for your final years. It's called Compose Your Life Song. On there are some great resources. Dr. Julie Masters was one of our experts that we used to help create some of those materials. So if you are interested in learning more, please check out that information. Our helpforalzheimersfamilies.com site also has great resources. You can sign up for that email list that I was talking about. We have a great community where we share out ideas of caregivers from other caregivers, and then caregiverstress.com to help manage all of those emotions that come along with caregiving. If you need extra support in the home, you can always visit homeinstead.com. And if you're not like a member of our Facebook page, please join us. It's a great community. We also have Confidence to Care with some additional great resources on Alzheimer's and dementia care. And then Dr. Masters mentioned elder care resources, so you can visit eldercare.acl.gov. And then when we send out the recording of today's webinar, we are jotting down all those books that Dr. Masters has been referencing, so we'll send those out. So if you're interested in picking up any of those books, it sounds like they're wonderful reads, so we'll make sure that you get all of that information. And then also, we wanted to share our next live chat with you. It'll be coming up in the month of June. So mark your calendars for June 7th. It'll be at 12 p.m. Eastern time. We'll be talking about Lewy body dementia. So if you know someone who has a loved one with Lewy body dementia, or somebody living with that diagnosis that wants to tune in, please share that information with them. But just finally, Julie, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks to everyone on the call for tuning in. This is such an important topic. We actually had somebody write in here at the very end and said, thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. This has been such a great topic. So I would agree with Anita's sentiments there. Julie, thank you so much for coming on and sharing the latest research, sharing your wealth of knowledge and experience with us. It's been a true delight.
Lakelyn, it's been my pleasure, and I just wish all the caregivers listening all the very best in life, and to know that there are plenty of resources out there to help you to continue to do the job that you do each and every day.
Thank you. All right, everyone. Well, we will see you we'll hear you in June. Please tune in to next month's webinar. In the meantime, have a wonderful rest of your day and take good care of yourselves. Bye.